Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in American history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know how far these documented accounts reach and at what moments of the day or night. In 1843, the city of Philadelphia bore witness to what would later be described by historians as one of the most chilling examples of medical exploitation disguised as scientific advancement. The case centered around Dr. Silas Hartwell, a physician whose reputation for treating ailments among the wealthy families of Society Hill masked a far darker truth that would remain hidden for nearly 25 years. Dr. Hartwell operated from a 3-story brick mansion on Pine Street, a structure that had been converted into both his residence and medical practice. The building, constructed in 1798, featured a peculiar architectural detail that would prove significant, a cellar system that extended far deeper than neighboring properties, with thick stone walls that muffled sound almost entirely. City records from 1842 show that Hartwell had requested permits for medical storage renovations to the basement area, though what precisely required such extensive soundproofing was never questioned by local authorities. The doctor's household included 7 enslaved individuals, a number that placed him among the larger slaveholders in the immediate area, despite Pennsylvania's Gradual Abolition Act. Among the enslaved was Samuel, aged 28, listed in property records as a general laborer; Mary, 26, designated as house servant; David, 31, recorded as medical assistant; Ruth, 24, kitchen and laundry; Thomas, 27, grounds and maintenance; Elizabeth, 29, nursing aid; and James, 25, whose occupation was curiously listed only as subject. Neighbors on Pine Street would later recall that Dr. Hartwell's property maintained an unusual silence, particularly during evening hours when other households typically showed signs of domestic activity. Through a legal loophole involving temporary residence claims and medical necessity documentation, Hartwell maintained ownership of these individuals while practicing in what was technically becoming a free state. Mrs. Adelaide Cromwell, who resided 2 houses down, mentioned in a letter to her sister dated September 1843 that she found it peculiar how the doctor's servants were rarely seen in daylight, despite the typical practice of enslaved individuals being assigned outdoor duties or errands that would make them visible in the neighborhood. The doctor himself was described by contemporary accounts as a man of average height with prematurely graying hair and hands that bore unusual staining, initially attributed to his work with medicinal compounds. Born in Charleston in 1808 to a family involved in rice plantation management, Hartwell had received medical training at the University of Pennsylvania before establishing his Philadelphia practice in 1839. His credentials were legitimate, and his treatment of prominent families had earned him respect within certain social circles, though some colleagues noted his particular interest in what he termed constitutional differences between races. During the winter months of 1843, a pattern began to emerge that would only become clear through later testimony. Deliveries to the Hartwell property increased significantly, with suppliers noting unusual requests for items not typically associated with standard medical practice. A receipt book recovered years later showed orders for restraining devices described as medical apparatus for patient stability, unusual quantities of chloroform and ether, and specialized surgical instruments typically used in anatomical dissection rather than treatment. The first indication that something was amiss came from Dr. Theodore Morrison, a colleague who had occasion to visit Hartwell's practice in early 1844. Morrison later testified that during his visit, he heard what sounded like muffled crying coming from somewhere below the main floor. When he inquired about the sound, Hartwell explained that he was treating a patient suffering from hysteric episodes and that isolation was necessary for proper care. Morrison accepted this explanation at the time, though he noted that the crying seemed to continue for an unusually extended period. Records from the Philadelphia Free Produce Society, an organization that monitored the treatment of enslaved individuals in the city, contain a complaint filed in March 1844 by a neighbor who reported seeing evidence of distress among the doctor's servants. The complainant, whose identity was recorded only as a concerned Christian, described observing individuals in the doctor's yard who appeared to be suffering from untreated injuries or illness, walking with difficulty and showing signs of extreme fatigue. The complaint was investigated by a society representative who visited the property and was given a tour of the main floors by Dr. Hartwell. The representative's report noted that the enslaved individuals he encountered appeared subdued but adequately clothed and fed, and no further action was taken. What the inspector did not see were the modifications Hartwell had made to the cellar levels. According to blueprints discovered during an 1868 renovation of the property, the basement had been divided into several small chambers, each equipped with drainage systems and ventilation that led not to the outside, but to a central filtration system that eliminated odors before any air reached the upper floors. The chambers were accessible only through a concealed entrance behind what appeared to be a standard root cellar, and each room contained fixtures that seemed designed for restraining individuals rather than storing goods. The doctor's method involved selecting individuals from among his enslaved population for what he documented as constitutional research studies. These studies, detailed in journals discovered years later, purported to investigate differences in pain response, healing rates, and anatomical structure between races. Hartwell justified these activities in his private writings as contributions to medical science that would benefit the understanding of human physiology and improve treatment methods for all populations. The reality, as reconstructed from his meticulous record-keeping, involved systematic torture disguised as experimentation. Hartwell's subjects were typically isolated in the basement chambers for periods ranging from several days to weeks. During this time, they were subjected to procedures that included surgical investigation without anesthesia, exposure to extreme temperatures to test tolerance, deliberate infection with diseases to observe progression, and the administration of various substances to study toxic effects. The doctor maintained detailed charts tracking each subject's responses, recovery times, and what he termed constitutional limits. The enslaved individuals who survived these experiences were returned to general household duties with explicit threats about the consequences of discussing their treatment. According to testimony collected much later, those who had been subjected to Hartwell's experiments developed a pattern of extreme compliance and withdrawal from normal social interaction, even among their fellow enslaved individuals. This isolation served the doctor's purposes by ensuring that his activities remained concealed and that potential witnesses were too traumatized to provide coherent accounts of their experiences. Samuel, the 28-year-old listed as a general laborer, appears to have been among the first subjects of Hartwell's experiments based on journal entries dating to late 1843. The doctor's notes describe testing Samuel's neurological responses to graduated physical stimulus, a euphemism that covered a range of procedures designed to map pain tolerance and nerve function. These sessions, conducted over several weeks during the winter months, left Samuel with permanent damage to his left arm and a pronounced limp that neighbors noticed but attributed to a work-related accident. Mary, designated as a house servant, was subjected to what Hartwell documented as reproductive system investigation during the spring of 1844. The doctor's stated objective was to study differences in female anatomy and response to various interventions. Mary's treatment resulted in internal injuries that caused persistent bleeding and made normal movement difficult for months afterward. When neighbors inquired about her obvious discomfort, Hartwell explained that she was suffering from a female complaint that required ongoing medical supervision. David, listed as a medical assistant, had previously worked alongside Hartwell in treating white patients and had acquired some knowledge of medical procedures. This familiarity with the doctor's work made him particularly valuable for certain experiments, but also meant that he understood the true nature of what was being done to him and his fellow enslaved individuals. According to later testimony, David attempted on several occasions to document what was happening in the basement chambers, but was prevented from doing so by the constant supervision and the threats of escalated punishment for any resistance. The systematic nature of Hartwell's activities required careful scheduling and record-keeping to avoid detection while maintaining his legitimate medical practice. Morning hours were typically devoted to treating paying patients in the upper floors of the building, while afternoon and evening periods were reserved for what he termed research activities in the basement area. The soundproofing proved effective in preventing any indication of the basement activities from reaching the upper floors, where legitimate patients might be receiving treatment. During the summer of 1844, Hartwell's experiments expanded to include what he described as anatomical comparison studies. These procedures involved systematic dissection of living subjects to examine internal structures and organ function. The doctor's notes indicate that he was particularly interested in what he believed were fundamental anatomical differences between races, and he conducted increasingly invasive procedures in pursuit of this research. Subjects who died during these experiments were disposed of through a network of body brokers who supplied cadavers to medical schools, ensuring that the deaths would not be investigated or traced back to Hartwell's property. Ruth, the 24-year-old assigned to kitchen and laundry duties, became a subject of particular interest to Hartwell during this period. His notes describe her as exhibiting unusual resilience to standard procedures, which resulted in progressively more extreme experiments as the doctor attempted to identify what he termed her constitutional limits. Ruth's treatment extended over several months and included exposure to experimental drugs, deliberate infection with various diseases, and surgical procedures designed to test healing response under different conditions. Thomas, responsible for grounds and maintenance, was subjected to experiments involving exposure to extreme environmental conditions. Hartwell's research in this area focused on testing temperature tolerance, dehydration limits, and recovery from various forms of physical stress. These experiments typically involved confining Thomas in specially modified chambers where temperature, humidity, and air circulation could be controlled to create specific environmental conditions. The doctor's notes tracked Thomas's responses to these conditions and his recovery times between sessions. Elizabeth, designated as a nursing aide, had some experience with patient care that made her useful to Hartwell in his legitimate practice. However, her knowledge of medical procedures also made her a valuable research subject for experiments involving medical intervention and treatment response. According to the doctor's records, Elizabeth was used to test various surgical techniques, drug interactions, and recovery protocols under controlled conditions that would not have been possible with paying patients. James, whose occupation was listed only as subject, appears to have been acquired specifically for research purposes rather than general household duties. Hartwell's notes indicate that James was selected based on specific physical characteristics that made him suitable for particular types of experiments. His treatment was the most extensive and systematic of any of the enslaved individuals, involving multiple sessions per week over extended periods and encompassing all of the different categories of research that Hartwell was conducting. The doctor's methodology involved detailed documentation of each procedure, including sketches, measurements, and observations about subject responses. These records were maintained in a series of locked journals kept in a hidden compartment behind the main basement laboratory area. The journals reveal a systematic approach to experimentation that progressed from basic pain tolerance testing to increasingly complex procedures involving surgical intervention, drug testing, and anatomical investigation. By 1845, Hartwell had established what he considered a comprehensive research program that utilized all 7 of his enslaved subjects on a rotating basis. The schedule was designed to ensure that individuals had sufficient recovery time between sessions to maintain their effectiveness as experimental subjects while maximizing the doctor's research output. This systematic approach required careful planning to coordinate with his legitimate medical practice and to maintain the appearance of normal household operations. The first serious threat to Hartwell's activities came in late 1845, when David, the medical assistant, attempted to escape the property and seek help from abolitionist organizations operating in Philadelphia. David's knowledge of medical procedures and his extended exposure to the doctor's research activities had given him a detailed understanding of what was being done to the enslaved individuals. His escape attempt was unsuccessful, but it demonstrated that despite the isolation and intimidation tactics, some subjects retained enough awareness and determination to seek outside intervention. Following David's failed escape attempt, Hartwell implemented additional security measures designed to prevent any further attempts at outside contact. These measures included more restrictive movement controls, increased surveillance of the enslaved individuals, and the installation of additional locks and barriers throughout the basement area. The doctor also began using chemical restraints more frequently, administering drugs that would reduce subjects' ability to plan or execute escape attempts while maintaining their usefulness for research purposes. The isolation of Hartwell's subjects was reinforced by their physical condition following experimental sessions. Individuals who had been subjected to recent procedures were typically unable to perform normal activities and required extended recovery periods. This cycle of debilitation and recovery ensured that there was always at least one individual who was too compromised to assist others in escape attempts or outside communication. The rotating schedule also meant that the strongest individuals were never available at the same time to coordinate resistance efforts. During 1846, Hartwell's research expanded to include comparative studies involving multiple subjects simultaneously. These experiments were designed to test identical procedures on different individuals to identify variations in response and recovery. The comparative approach required careful coordination and timing to ensure that subjects were available for simultaneous testing while maintaining the doctor's ability to conduct his legitimate medical practice without interruption. The increased frequency and intensity of experimental sessions during this period resulted in more obvious signs of distress among the enslaved individuals. Neighbors began to notice that the doctor's servants appeared increasingly withdrawn and showed physical signs of poor health despite apparently adequate food and shelter. However, these observations were generally attributed to the normal hardships of enslaved life rather than specific mistreatment, and no formal complaints were filed with authorities. Samuel's condition deteriorated significantly during this period as a result of repeated experimental sessions involving nerve and muscle function testing. The procedures had caused progressive damage to his motor control and coordination, making it increasingly difficult for him to perform normal household duties. Hartwell's notes document his interest in tracking the progression of this deterioration as a study of long-term effects of neurological intervention. Mary's health continued to decline as a result of the reproductive system experiments conducted during the previous year. Her condition required ongoing medical attention, which Hartwell provided while documenting her symptoms and recovery progress as part of his research. The doctor's notes indicate that he was particularly interested in studying the long-term effects of his procedures and used Mary's case as an opportunity to observe healing and adaptation over extended periods. The systematic documentation of subject conditions and experimental results created a comprehensive record of Hartwell's activities that would later prove crucial in understanding the full scope of his research program. The journals contained detailed descriptions of procedures, measurements of subject responses, sketches of anatomical observations, and theoretical conclusions drawn from the accumulated data. This documentation revealed a level of organization and scientific methodology that distinguished Hartwell's activities from random acts of cruelty. By early 1847, the physical condition of several subjects had deteriorated to the point where their usefulness for further experimentation was significantly reduced. Rather than discontinuing his research, Hartwell began exploring procedures designed to restore subject functionality while gathering additional data about recovery and adaptation processes. These rehabilitation experiments involved testing various treatments and interventions to reverse or compensate for damage caused by previous procedures. The rehabilitation phase of Hartwell's research provided new opportunities for experimentation while addressing the practical problem of maintaining an adequate subject population. The doctor's notes describe testing different approaches to treating nerve damage, muscle deterioration, and organ dysfunction caused by earlier experiments. These procedures were documented with the same scientific rigor as the original experiments and provided additional data for the doctor's research objectives. Ruth's resilience to previous experimental procedures made her a particularly valuable subject during this period. Hartwell's notes indicate that her unusual recovery capacity provided opportunities to test more extreme procedures while studying the limits of human adaptability. The doctor's research during this phase involved progressively more invasive interventions designed to identify the specific factors that contributed to Ruth's apparent resistance to experimental damage. Thomas's experience with environmental exposure experiments had provided Hartwell with extensive data about human responses to controlled conditions. During 1847, this research expanded to include recovery studies designed to understand how subjects adapted to repeated exposure and what factors influenced their ability to withstand ongoing environmental stress. These experiments required extended observation periods and careful monitoring of physiological responses over time. Elizabeth's background in patient care made her particularly useful for testing medical procedures and treatment protocols. Hartwell's notes describe using her knowledge and experience to evaluate the effectiveness of different approaches to medical intervention while simultaneously studying her responses as an experimental subject. This dual role provided the doctor with unique insights into both the practical application of medical procedures and their effects on unwilling subjects. James continued to be subjected to the most comprehensive experimental program, serving as the primary subject for new procedures and the most extensive forms of intervention. His treatment during 1847 included experimental surgeries designed to test new techniques, exposure to various chemical compounds to study toxic effects, and participation in comparative studies involving multiple simultaneous procedures. The complexity of Hartwell's research program during this period required increasingly sophisticated record-keeping and documentation systems. The doctor maintained detailed charts tracking each subject's medical history, experimental exposure, recovery progress, and ongoing condition. This information was supplemented by daily observation notes, weekly summary reports, and monthly analytical reviews designed to identify patterns and trends in the accumulated data. The scientific methodology employed by Hartwell included control procedures designed to verify his experimental results and ensure the validity of his conclusions. These controls involved testing identical procedures on multiple subjects, repeating experiments under different conditions, and comparing results across different time periods. The systematic approach demonstrated a level of organization and planning that reflected genuine scientific training despite the unethical nature of the research. During the summer of 1847, an unexpected complication arose when Dr. Morrison, Hartwell's colleague, requested permission to observe some of the doctor's research activities. Morrison had become interested in Hartwell's claims about constitutional differences between races and wanted to witness the experimental procedures firsthand. This request created a significant threat to the secrecy of Hartwell's activities and required careful management to avoid exposure. Hartwell's response to Morrison's request involved creating a sanitized version of his research program that would satisfy his colleagues' curiosity while concealing the true nature and extent of his experimental activities. The doctor prepared a demonstration session involving minimal procedures on carefully selected subjects who were most likely to appear cooperative and healthy. This performance required extensive preparation and coaching of the subjects to ensure that they would not reveal information about their actual treatment. The demonstration session was conducted in a specially prepared area of the basement that had been modified to appear as a legitimate research laboratory rather than the experimental chambers used for more invasive procedures. Hartwell presented his work as a comparative study of anatomical and physiological differences that would contribute to improved medical treatment for all populations. The selected procedures were designed to appear scientific and medical, while avoiding anything that would clearly indicate the true nature of the ongoing research. Morrison's visit was successful from Hartwell's perspective, in that it provided external validation for his research claims without exposing the systematic torture and experimentation that characterized his actual activities. The colleague left with a positive impression of Hartwell's scientific methodology and contributed to spreading the doctor's reputation as a serious researcher investigating important medical questions. This endorsement provided additional protection for Hartwell's activities by establishing credibility with other members of the medical community. Following Morrison's visit, Hartwell expanded his network of professional contacts to include other physicians and researchers who might be interested in his work. These relationships provided opportunities to discuss research findings and theoretical conclusions while maintaining strict secrecy about experimental methods and subject treatment. The doctor's scientific credibility was enhanced by his ability to present detailed data and sophisticated analysis based on his extensive experimentation. The professional recognition that Hartwell gained during this period allowed him to operate with reduced scrutiny from local authorities and neighbors. His reputation as a serious medical researcher provided an explanation for the unusual aspects of his household and activities that might otherwise have attracted suspicion. The doctor's legitimate practice continued to prosper, providing both financial resources and social standing that facilitated his continued research activities. By 1848, Hartwell's experimental program had evolved into a sophisticated research operation that generated extensive data about human responses to various forms of intervention and stress. The accumulated information filled multiple journals and included detailed documentation of hundreds of individual procedures conducted over several years. The scope and organization of this research represented one of the most systematic programs of human experimentation conducted during this period in American history. The subjects of Hartwell's experiments had developed various strategies for coping with their situation, including forms of mutual support and communication that occurred despite the doctor's efforts to maintain isolation between individuals. These relationships provided some emotional sustenance and practical assistance that helped subjects survive the ongoing experimental procedures. However, the effectiveness of these support systems was limited by the physical condition of participants and the constant threat of punishment for unauthorized communication. Samuel's deteriorating condition during 1848 made him less useful as an experimental subject, but Hartwell continued to use him for observational studies, tracking the long-term effects of neurological damage. The doctor's notes describe monitoring Samuel's progressive disability as a way of understanding how the nervous system adapted to ongoing damage and what factors influenced the rate of deterioration. Mary's health had stabilized somewhat following the previous year's rehabilitation experiments, but her condition remained significantly compromised as a result of the reproductive system research. Hartwell continued to study her case as an example of long-term adaptation to internal injury, and used her ongoing symptoms to test various treatment approaches and recovery interventions. David's failed escape attempt had resulted in additional experimental procedures designed as punishment, while providing research data about responses to escalated stress and trauma. His knowledge of medical procedures continued to make him valuable for certain types of experiments, but his obvious hostility and resistance required careful management to prevent further escape attempts or efforts to communicate with outside authorities. The systematic nature of Hartwell's research program required ongoing acquisition of supplies and equipment that could potentially attract attention from suppliers or delivery personnel. The doctor managed this risk by distributing orders among multiple vendors and providing medical justifications for unusual items. His legitimate practice provided cover for most purchases, while specialized equipment was obtained through professional networks and medical supply companies that served research institutions. During the winter of 1848, a significant development occurred when Thomas died as a result of complications from environmental exposure experiments. His death created both a practical problem in terms of maintaining an adequate subject population and a security risk related to disposing of the body without attracting official attention. Hartwell's solution involved using his network of contacts in the medical education system to arrange for the body to be transferred to an anatomy school as an unclaimed cadaver. The death of Thomas also provided Hartwell with an opportunity to conduct post-mortem examination and documentation that would contribute to his research objectives. The doctor's notes describe detailed anatomical investigation designed to understand the specific effects of environmental exposure experiments and to identify factors that might predict subject responses to similar procedures. This post-mortem research was conducted in the basement laboratory and documented with the same scientific rigor as the living subject experiments. Following Thomas's death, Hartwell implemented modifications to his experimental protocols designed to reduce the risk of additional subject deaths while maintaining research productivity. These changes involved more careful monitoring of subject condition during procedures, modified recovery periods between sessions, and adjusted intervention thresholds designed to prevent subjects from reaching critical condition levels. The reduced subject population following Thomas's death required modifications to Hartwell's research schedule and experimental design. The doctor adapted by focusing more intensive study on the remaining 6 individuals while developing new experimental approaches that would maximize research output despite the reduced number of available subjects. This adaptation demonstrated the systematic nature of Hartwell's research program and his commitment to continuing the work despite practical obstacles. During 1849, Hartwell's research expanded to include psychological experimentation designed to study mental responses to various forms of stress and manipulation. These experiments involved isolation techniques, sensory deprivation, controlled nutrition, and various forms of psychological pressure designed to test mental resilience and adaptation. The psychological research provided new dimensions to the doctor's data collection, while requiring minimal additional equipment or facilities. Ruth continued to demonstrate unusual resilience to experimental procedures, which made her increasingly valuable as a research subject. Hartwell's notes indicate that her case provided unique insights into human adaptation and survival mechanisms that contributed significantly to his theoretical understanding. The doctor's research during this period involved increasingly sophisticated attempts to identify the specific factors that contributed to Ruth's apparent resistance to experimental damage. Elizabeth's experience with patient care continued to make her useful for testing medical procedures and treatment approaches. However, her ongoing exposure to experimental procedures had begun to affect her ability to assist with legitimate patient care, creating practical challenges for maintaining Hartwell's regular medical practice. The doctor adapted by reducing Elizabeth's involvement in patient care while expanding her role as an experimental subject. James remained the primary subject for the most comprehensive experimental procedures, including testing of new techniques and participation in comparative studies. His treatment during 1849 included experimental surgeries designed to advance Hartwell's understanding of anatomical and physiological function, exposure to new chemical compounds, and participation in psychological experiments designed to test mental responses to various forms of stress. The accumulation of research data over several years had provided Hartwell with extensive information about human responses to various forms of intervention and stress. The doctor began developing theoretical frameworks designed to explain his observations and to identify general principles that could be applied to broader medical and scientific questions. This theoretical work represented the culmination of years of systematic experimentation and demonstrated the scientific objectives that motivated Hartwell's research program. The doctor's theoretical conclusions included claims about fundamental anatomical and physiological differences between races that he believed were supported by his experimental data. These conclusions were incorporated into papers and presentations that Hartwell shared with professional colleagues, providing scientific justification for racial inequality while concealing the unethical methods used to gather supporting evidence. During the early months of 1850, Hartwell's activities began to attract attention from sources outside his immediate professional network. A group of abolitionist investigators had begun tracking reports of unusual activities at properties where enslaved individuals were held, and several aspects of the doctor's household had been noted as potentially suspicious. These investigators were motivated by reports from former enslaved individuals who described unusual treatment patterns and physical evidence of systematic abuse. The abolitionist investigation focused initially on gathering testimony from neighbors and community members who might have observed suspicious activities or evidence of mistreatment. Several residents of Pine Street were interviewed about their observations of Hartwell's property and household, though most were reluctant to provide detailed information about the activities of a respected member of the medical community. Mrs. Cromwell's earlier observations about the unusual silence at Hartwell's property became part of the investigative record, along with reports from other neighbours about the apparent poor health and withdrawn behaviour of the doctor's enslaved individuals. These observations, while not conclusive individually, formed a pattern that suggested systematic mistreatment beyond typical enslaved conditions. The investigation expanded to include examination of public records related to Hartwell's property, medical practice, and business relationships. Investigators discovered the unusual modifications to the basement area, the extensive orders for medical equipment and supplies, and the pattern of body disposals through medical education networks. These findings provided circumstantial evidence supporting suspicions about the doctor's activities. One of the key breakthroughs in the investigation came when investigators located a former supplier who had become suspicious about some of Hartwell's equipment orders. This individual provided detailed records of purchases that included restraining devices, specialized surgical instruments, and chemical compounds that were not typically used in standard medical practice. The supplier's testimony provided concrete evidence linking Hartwell to activities that appeared to go beyond legitimate medical treatment. The mounting evidence gathered by abolitionist investigators was compiled into a formal complaint that was submitted to local authorities in late 1850. The complaint included witness testimony, documentary evidence, and expert analysis suggesting that Hartwell was conducting unauthorized human experimentation on his enslaved individuals. The submission of this complaint initiated an official investigation that would ultimately expose the full scope of the doctor's activities. The official investigation began with a search warrant for Hartwell's property that was executed in December 1850. Investigators discovered the basement laboratory facilities, the concealed chambers, the extensive documentation of experimental procedures, and physical evidence of ongoing human experimentation. The search also revealed the current condition of the surviving enslaved individuals and provided direct evidence of systematic abuse and medical torture. The discovery of Hartwell's journals and research documentation provided investigators with detailed records of years of systematic human experimentation. The journals contained descriptions of hundreds of individual procedures, detailed analysis of subject responses, theoretical conclusions drawn from the accumulated data, and evidence of the scientific methodology that guided the doctor's research program. This documentation provided unprecedented insight into systematic human experimentation during this period. The condition of the surviving enslaved individuals when they were discovered provided shocking evidence of the effects of prolonged experimental abuse. Samuel's neurological damage, Mary's ongoing health problems, David's psychological trauma, Ruth's physical deterioration despite her earlier resilience, Elizabeth's medical complications, and James's extensive scarring and disability all testified to years of systematic torture disguised as medical research. The arrest of Dr. Hartwell in January 1851 marked the end of nearly 8 years of systematic human experimentation that had involved hundreds of individual procedures conducted on 7 enslaved individuals. The scope and organization of the research program, as documented in the recovered journals, represented one of the most extensive cases of human experimentation recorded during this period in American history. If you're enjoying the story and feel like helping the channel with any amount, please support us by clicking the thanks button and donating whatever you wish. This really helps the channel keep posting new stories. The legal proceedings against Hartwell were complicated by the legal status of enslaved individuals and the difficulty of prosecuting crimes committed against people who were considered property under existing laws. However, the systematic nature of the abuse and the clear evidence of torture and murder provided grounds for prosecution under statutes related to cruelty and unlawful killing. The case attracted national attention and contributed to growing public awareness of the brutal realities of slavery. The testimony provided by surviving subjects during Hartwell's trial offered detailed accounts of years of systematic torture and abuse. Despite their traumatized condition and limited legal standing, their testimony provided crucial evidence about the nature and extent of the doctor's experimental program. The courage required to testify against their former captor demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of years of systematic dehumanization. The trial proceedings revealed that Hartwell's activities had been facilitated by a network of suppliers, colleagues, and institutions that had either knowingly or unknowingly supported his research program. The investigation of these connections exposed the broader systems that made such abuse possible and highlighted the need for oversight and regulation of medical research activities. Dr. Hartwell was convicted of multiple charges related to torture, unlawful imprisonment, and murder in June 1851. He was sentenced to death, though the sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment due to intervention by medical colleagues who argued that his research, while ethically questionable, had contributed to medical knowledge. Hartwell died in prison in 1857, still maintaining that his work had been justified by its scientific value. The surviving subjects of Hartwell's experiments faced ongoing challenges related to their physical and psychological trauma. Samuel's neurological damage left him permanently disabled. Mary's health problems continued to require medical attention. David struggled with psychological trauma that affected his ability to function. Ruth's resilience had finally been broken by years of abuse. Elizabeth suffered from ongoing medical complications, and James required extensive medical care to address the cumulative effects of years of experimentation. Efforts to provide treatment and support for the survivors were limited by the medical understanding of trauma available at the time and by the social attitudes toward formerly enslaved individuals. Some support was provided by abolitionist organizations and religious groups, but the comprehensive care needed to address the complex effects of systematic abuse was not available. The survivors' experiences highlighted the long-term consequences of systematic human experimentation and the inadequacy of existing systems for providing appropriate treatment. The case documents and evidence gathered during the investigation of Hartwell's activities were archived by the court system and later transferred to the Pennsylvania Historical Society. However, many of these records were subsequently lost or destroyed during administrative reorganizations in the 1860s and 70s. Some documentation survived in private collections and institutional archives, but the complete record of the case was never fully preserved. Efforts to research and document the Hartwell case during the early 20th century were hampered by the loss of original records and the reluctance of institutions to acknowledge their historical connections to human experimentation. Some scholars attempted to reconstruct the case based on surviving documentation and family testimony, but these efforts were incomplete and often met with resistance from medical institutions concerned about their historical reputations. The legacy of the Hartwell case includes its contribution to early discussions about medical ethics and human research standards. While formal ethical guidelines for human research would not be established for many years, the case provided evidence of the potential for abuse in unregulated research environments and highlighted the need for oversight and protection of vulnerable populations. The basement laboratory at Hartwell's former property was sealed after his arrest and remained undisturbed for many years. The building changed ownership several times during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with most owners apparently unaware of its history. The sealed basement area was finally opened during renovation work in 1968, revealing preserved equipment and documentation that provided additional evidence about the scope of Hartwell's activities. The 1968 discovery led to renewed interest in the Hartwell case among historians and medical researchers studying the history of human experimentation. However, the documentation recovered from the basement was limited, and efforts to conduct comprehensive research were constrained by institutional sensitivities and limited access to surviving records. The materials were eventually donated to a university archive, where they remain available for scholarly research. Today, the Hartwell case is recognized as an early example of systematic human experimentation in American history and serves as a reminder of the potential for abuse when vulnerable populations are subjected to medical research without proper oversight or protection. The case continues to be studied by historians, medical ethicists, and human rights researchers interested in understanding the historical development of research ethics and the protection of human subjects. The building that once housed Hartwell's practice and laboratory has been converted to residential apartments, with most current residents unaware of its historical significance. The basement areas have been completely renovated, eliminating any remaining physical evidence of their former use. A small historical marker placed by the Pennsylvania Historical Society acknowledges the building's connection to early medical research, though it does not provide details about the nature of Hartwell's activities. The impact of the Hartwell case extends beyond its immediate historical significance to broader questions about medical research ethics, institutional accountability, and the protection of vulnerable populations. The systematic nature of the abuse and the professional standing of the perpetrator demonstrated how institutional authority could be used to facilitate horrific crimes while maintaining an appearance of scientific legitimacy. The failure of contemporary oversight systems to detect or prevent Hartwell's activities, despite clear warning signs, highlighted the importance of external monitoring and accountability mechanisms in protecting research subjects. The case contributed to growing recognition that professional credentials and institutional authority were insufficient safeguards against research abuse, and that specific protections were needed for vulnerable populations. The long-term effects experienced by Hartwell's surviving subjects provided early evidence of the lasting impact of research abuse and highlighted the need for comprehensive support systems for individuals who had been subjected to unethical experimentation. Their experiences demonstrated that the consequences of research abuse extended far beyond the immediate physical effects to include psychological trauma and ongoing medical complications. The documentation of Hartwell's research methods and findings raised complex questions about the use of knowledge gained through unethical means. While some medical advances may have resulted from his systematic experimentation, the unethical nature of his methods meant that any potential benefits were fundamentally tainted by the circumstances of their acquisition. The case also highlighted the intersection of racial ideology and medical research during this period in American history. Hartwell's claims about constitutional differences between races reflected broader social attitudes that dehumanized enslaved individuals and made it easier to justify their use as experimental subjects. The case demonstrated how scientific research could be used to support and legitimize systems of oppression and inequality. Recent scholarship on the Hartwell case has focused on understanding it within the broader context of medical research on enslaved and marginalized populations during the antebellum period. This research has revealed that Hartwell's activities, while extreme in their systematic nature, were part of a larger pattern of medical exploitation that characterized medical education and research during this era. The case continues to be relevant to contemporary discussions about medical research ethics, informed consent, and the protection of vulnerable populations. Historical analysis of cases like Hartwell's contributes to understanding how unethical research practices develop and persist, and how institutional systems can either facilitate or prevent research abuse. Educational programs about the Hartwell case are now included in medical ethics curricula at several universities, where they serve as historical examples of research misconduct and contribute to training future medical researchers about the importance of ethical standards and human subject protections. The Pine Street building where Hartwell conducted his experiment stands as a silent reminder of one of the darkest chapters in American medical history. Though the physical evidence has long since been removed and the building repurposed, the historical significance of what occurred there continues to resonate with those who seek to understand and prevent similar abuses in the future. And perhaps most disturbing of all, recent discoveries in archived materials suggest that Hartwell's case may not have been unique. References in contemporary medical journals and correspondence indicate that similar research programs may have been conducted by other physicians during this period, though the full extent of such activities remains unknown. The possibility that Hartwell's systematic experimentation was part of a broader pattern of medical exploitation makes his case not just an isolated example of individual misconduct, but potentially representative of more widespread practices that have yet to be fully documented or understood. The implications of this broader pattern became evident in 1862, when Union forces occupying former Confederate territories began discovering similar facilities at other medical properties. A report filed by Colonel James Patterson of the Pennsylvania Regiment described finding evidence of systematic medical experimentation at a plantation outside Charleston that bore striking similarities to Hartwell's Philadelphia operation. The basement facilities, documentation methods, and even some of the specialized equipment matched details from the Hartwell investigation. These discoveries suggested that Hartwell's activities may have been part of a coordinated research network that operated across multiple states during the 1840s and 1850s. References found in his journals to collaborative research partners and comparative data exchange indicated communication with other physicians conducting similar experiments. However, the Civil War disrupted further investigation of these connections, and many potential sites were destroyed or abandoned before they could be thoroughly examined. The full scope of this research network was never established. Military records from the occupation period mention at least 6 other properties where similar facilities were discovered, but systematic investigation was prevented by the chaos of wartime and the priority given to immediate military objectives. By the time civilian authorities could conduct proper investigations, most evidence had been destroyed or scattered. Dr. Morrison, Hartwell's colleague who had visited the Pine Street laboratory, disappeared from Philadelphia in 1853, 2 years after Hartwell's conviction. His departure was initially attributed to professional disgrace following the revelation of his connection to the case, but letters discovered in 1864 suggested that he had relocated to establish a new practice in Texas. These letters contained references to continuing the research under more favorable circumstances, indicating that the network may have attempted to reconstitute itself in territories where oversight was limited. The survivors of Hartwell's experiments faced a society unprepared to address their specific needs. Samuel died in 1855 from complications related to his neurological damage. Mary lived until 1861 but never recovered her health. David eventually learned to read and write, using these skills to document his experiences in a memoir that was never published but remained in family possession. Ruth died in 1858. Elizabeth lived until 1863, receiving care from a religious organization. James survived until 1866, the longest-lived of all the subjects, though he required constant medical attention. The Pine Street property was sold to a merchant family in 1854, who sealed the basement permanently and converted the upper floors into a residence. The building remained in private hands until 1891, when it was sold to the city for conversion to municipal offices. During renovations in 1892, workers briefly reopened portions of the basement, but were ordered to seal them again after city officials reviewed the historical records. The case files from Hartwell's trial were transferred to the Pennsylvania State Archives in 1878, where they were catalogued and stored in the medical history section. However, a fire in 1881 destroyed portions of the archive, including most of the Hartwell documentation. Only fragmentary records survived, consisting mainly of court transcripts and some witness testimony. The detailed journals and scientific documentation that had provided the most comprehensive evidence of the experimental program were lost forever. Academic interest in the case was minimal during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, partly due to the loss of primary documentation, and partly due to institutional reluctance to acknowledge such dark chapters in medical history. The few scholars who attempted to research the case found limited cooperation from medical institutions and historical societies, many of which preferred to focus on more positive aspects of medical progress during the antebellum period. The basement of the Pine Street building was finally opened for the last time in 1968, during renovations to convert the structure to apartments. The construction crew discovered a sealed chamber containing some preserved equipment and a small cache of documents that had been overlooked during previous investigations. These materials were turned over to the University of Pennsylvania, where they were studied by medical historians and eventually deposited in the Special Collections Library. The 1968 discovery renewed scholarly interest in the Hartwell case and led to the first comprehensive academic study of systematic human experimentation during the antebellum period. However, this research was limited by the fragmentary nature of surviving evidence and by ongoing institutional sensitivities about acknowledging historical connections to unethical research practices. Today, the Hartwell case serves as a historical reminder of the potential for abuse when medical research operates without proper oversight or ethical constraints. The systematic nature of the experimentation and the professional standing of the perpetrator demonstrate how institutional authority can be exploited to facilitate horrific crimes while maintaining an appearance of scientific legitimacy. The building at the corner of Pine and 4th Street still stands, now housing residential apartments whose occupants are largely unaware of its dark history. The basement has been completely renovated and shows no trace of its former use. A small bronze plaque, installed by the Pennsylvania Historical Society in 1975, notes that the building was the site of early medical research activities, but provides no details about the nature of those activities. The legacy of Dr. Silas Hartwell and his victims remains largely forgotten by history, known only to a small number of medical historians and researchers studying the development of research ethics. The systematic torture and exploitation conducted under the guise of scientific advancement serves as a sobering reminder that the pursuit of knowledge, when divorced from ethical constraints and human compassion, can lead to the darkest chapters in human experience. In the end, perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Hartwell case is not just what was documented, but what remains unknown. The fragmentary evidence of a broader network, the destroyed documentation, and the possibility of other undiscovered sites suggest that this case may represent only a small portion of systematic human experimentation that occurred during this period. The silence that surrounds these activities, maintained by institutional reluctance and the passage of time, means that the full scope of such research may never be known. The basement chambers have been sealed, the journals have been lost, and the voices of the victims have been largely forgotten. But the questions raised by the Hartwell case continue to resonate. How many others suffered in similar circumstances? How many other physicians conducted comparable research? And how many other basement laboratories remain undiscovered, their secrets buried beneath layers of renovation and institutional silence? These questions may never be answered, but the obligation to remember, to bear witness, and to ensure that such horrors are never repeated remains as urgent today as it was when the basement doors were first opened and the full scope of Dr. Hartwell's crimes was finally brought to light.